We all know about the Napoleons, Caesars, and Churchills of history, and the roles they played in shaping the world we live in. School curriculums and university courses have churned out volumes of material that scholars debate over on a continuous basis as filmmakers keep dreaming up new ways of presenting their stories. But in amongst the giants of history, there are the innumerable little guys, the nameless labourers, soldiers and farmers upon whose backs and calloused hands history is actually made. The vast majority of these faceless battlers never ramboed their way through enemy lines, made scientific discoveries that eliminated a disease, or led their nations to triumph in war. They simply endured through unimaginable hardships. They did their duty and tried, through all of it, to live a semblance of a quiet, decent life. Some of them kept diaries or wrote memoirs that nowadays might be displayed in some dusty corner of a rural museum. But if we take the time to explore their stories, their destitute childhoods, exploitation, horrific experiences in war, their ongoing humility and seemingly incongruous fortitude and optimism, usually recorded in gritty, everyday language and unembellished by snobbish poetry or prose, we can learn far more about the human spirit and, because they're so much like us, be equally, if not more profoundly inspired than by the literary tomes of Tolstoy or Shakespeare. One such ordinary man was Albert Facey, born at the desperate tail end of the Australian gold rush, suffering incredible hardship, poverty and even child slavery, only to escape and survive like so many other Huckleberry Finns of his time, purely by his wits and determination, in a harsh, unforgiving land. Illiterate, he taught himself to read and write, and was soon swept up in the fervour of the Great War. Ending up in the hell of Gallipoli and its horrors of trench warfare, he was wounded and returned to Australia. His was a tale similar to many others, of one disaster after another, of narrow escapes and lean expectations, and yet, in his 80s, he was to name his published memoirs A Fortunate Life, reflecting his incredibly positive outlook on life. He was in many ways the archetypical battler of his era, one of the faceless legions of pioneers that built entire nations, and a voice from the past that we can all benefit listening to. Join us as we explore the life of this extraordinary yet ordinary man, and pause to take some inspiration during our own trying times from his indomitable spirit. During the 1850s, southeastern Australia had comparatively the highest output of gold in the entire world, making Melbourne, once an insignificant and isolated backwater, in the space of just 2 decades, one of the richest and most glamorous cities in the world. So much gold poured back to London that Britain paid off its entire national debt, catapulting it into the rapid industrial expansion that cemented its place as a premier colonial and naval power. But life in the makeshift gold rush camps was harsh, dangerous and violent. The rapid influx of thousands of miners and their families put pressure on sanitation and food supplies. Outbreaks of cholera, dysentery and typhoid were rampant, decimating the population, only for their ranks to be replaced by other eager dreamers, coming from all parts of the globe, gambling their life savings on the slim hope of making their fortune. By the mid-1890s, the alluvial deposits had been worked so intensely and the landscape scarred so profoundly that the mangled creeks and streams, mining camps and towns dried up just as fast as they once filled. The throngs of miners moved on to other sites, or interstate, leaving only ghost towns and abandoned camp ruins, worked by the very few impoverished settlers who couldn't afford to leave. It was into this rapidly fading dreamscape that Albert was born in 1894. His father, like so many others, travelled to the other side of the country with Albert's two older teenage brothers to try his luck in the new goldfields discovered in Western Australia, only to die of typhoid 2 years later. His mother soon abandoned the 4 younger children in the care of their grandparents and herself moved to Western Australia, promising to send aid and support, though none was ever to materialise, and the children rarely heard from her again. Albert's grandparents were hardly in a state to support 4 young children, and his grandfather soon fell ill from exhaustion and died. Their stalwart grandmother, working herself to the bone, also fell gravely ill and was forced to sell the family farm for a pittance to pay off growing debts. They all now moved to the west of the country, but Albert's mother refused to take them, and so they drifted to the Goldfields with an uncle, dwelling in drafty tents, living off the land by hunting possums and reptiles. The young children would scour the mining camps, living off scraps and collecting empty tins of food to melt the lining solder into ingots that would be sold for a meagre subsistence. Within a couple of years, the gold dried up here too, but the government came up with a scheme of offering land to settlers a few 100 miles away if they undertook to clear it of trees and commence pastoral activities. The children, now emaciated, in rags and barefoot, along with their ailing grandmother, moved with their uncle to remote bushland, where they would spend the next few years trapping animals for fur, living off the land, and clearing scrub to establish a farm. Eventually, the arid environment and harsh conditions made for little progress, and with so many mouths to feed, it was necessary to send the children out to other homesteads as hired labour. Albert, 8 years old at the time, was offered a job, keeping an old blind woman company while her own grown children were away working. He was promised plenty of food, new clothes and shoes, and an education, as well as wages for staying with the old woman. It seemed like a deal that was too good to be true, and to his horror, he soon found that it was. Albert was worked from dawn to dusk, tending animals, milking cows, and doing general farm work well beyond his capacity as a boy. He was regularly abused and even horsewhipped, once almost to the point of death, by a family of maniacs that turned out to be horse and cattle rustlers. Barefoot and in rags, he plotted his escape, but with his grandmother being several days' ride away, his chances of a getaway were slim, and he was threatened with death if he tried to escape. Albert nevertheless befriended a local Aboriginal boy who knew the territory and helped him hatch a plan of escape across country. So he stashed some provisions, made himself some cloth moccasins, and stole away one night while everyone was too drunk or asleep to notice him missing, as he headed out alone and in desperation in the dark, eventually hiking his way back to his uncle and grandmother several days later. He was only 10 years old. By now, his uncle had sufficiently cleared the land that they were growing wheat, but there was still too little to eat, and it wasn't long before Albert was reluctantly farmed out to other settlers in need of a labourer, each of whom had promised clothes, full board, and wages, but in the end also mistreating him and reneging on all their promises. Times were so tough that neighbour cheated neighbour, in a brutal and unforgiving environment where it was every man for himself. Eventually, he was again sent to work for a childless couple who had just moved from the city onto the land, and Albert's knowledge of farm life, though still a child, was invaluable to them. This time, his employers treated him very well, and as the months flew by, he was the happiest he had been since he could remember. The work was hard, and over the ensuing few years they battled bushfires, snakes, injuries, floods, and even pigs that were hard to handle, till they finally wrestled the farm into some semblance of success. This entire time, Albert's mother had not ever written, inquired, or sent any assistance, and his new mistress asked him to call her mother instead. Eventually, the couple proposed to adopt him, and Albert was ecstatic at the first experience of a proper family and a real home, and letters were soon written to solicitors to initiate the process. Seasons went by when the couple finally received a letter from Albert's real mother, who refused to consent to the adoption. Still only 12 years old, and his dream of a new family shattered, he eventually found out she had tried to extort money from the couple in return for her consent. Their attitude towards him now suddenly changed, and they became increasingly cold and transactional. Eventually, their relationship soured to the point he was forced to leave. But he soon found work again on a nearby farm. Settlers increasingly made their way inland from the cities to try their luck at farming, and most were dangerously lacking in both farm as well as bush experience, such that Albert slowly became a popular and valued labourer on many of their properties. He began to notice a change in general attitude, as so many inexperienced people needed to rely heavily on one another for advice and mutual assistance. People now seemed to be getting friendlier. As he moved from farm to farm, his skills continued to grow, and by 14 years of age was doing a man's work, clearing scrub and building fences, often giving advice to farmers triple his age, and all the while making some decent money. Still completely illiterate, he nevertheless felt an exhilarating independence and surging confidence, despite the hardships and physical labour. One of his employers taught him to ride, another to shoot, in order to keep off the numerous dingoes that were killing his sheep, and sure enough, Albert soon became a competent horseman and crack shot, taking good money for dingo scalps, that was now being offered as a reward by the government. With greater independence, he managed to visit his grandmother more often and enjoyed hiking in his leisure time, immersed in the sights and sounds of the Australian bush. He soon saved a considerable sum of money, bought his own clothes and a new rifle, and decided to teach himself to read, having never been to school so much as a day in his life. He began by borrowing books from new settlers who were often happy to help him out. A letter eventually did arrive from his mother requesting that he and his two brothers, also long at work on other people's properties, themselves would visit her in the city. His brothers left at once for the chance of a new life, but Albert felt suspicious about her motives and conflicted about presenting himself to the woman who abandoned him 9 years ago and then destroyed his single greatest chance of happiness in an act of cruel extortion. His grandmother cautioned him as well and told him if he chose to go, to keep his financial situation firmly to himself. He arrived in the suburbs of Perth and found his mother living in a modest apartment with a new husband and their 3 young children. She had wanted Albert and his brothers to stay, then promptly insisted on their paying full board and rent, and demanding access to their finances. Albert, disgusted by such a barefaced attempt at financial manipulation and too illiterate for a decent city job, decided to leave, but received word that a drought had caused the failure of crops all through his old farming community, with little work available there. He soon came across an advertisement for a stockman droving cattle on a remote station hundreds of kilometres to the north, in the wild and desolate outback where few white men ever ventured. He leapt at the chance to go back to the country and left his mother, with her crocodile tears, at the docks, where he boarded a ship to sail to Geraldton on the northwest coast. He arrived to find little work available locally, but the jovial youngster soon made an impression on several locals who suggested he travel inland where there would be more opportunities. He befriended a kangaroo shooter who, like Bert, as he came to be called, had made a decent living taking scalps and skins of kangaroos. These, along with dingoes and emus, had been declared pests, and the government paid a bounty for each kill. His new friend Bill, a bearded, weather-worn, middle-aged man, had been a stockman and shooter much of his life, and inspired Bert with his stories of adventure and the freedom of his roving lifestyle. He was headed inland himself and offered to lend Bert a horse so they could travel there together. The small station of Mulluwa was a junction and depot for the transfer of crops and livestock to the coast. Like so many other small, dusty towns, it had few permanent inhabitants, and all life revolved around the pub. It was here that Bert was offered a job as assistant cook, while mustering and droving thousands of head of cattle over the course of 5 to 6 months over some of the most inhospitable country in the world. Despite only being a 14-year-old jackaroo, he would receive a full man's wages at the rate of £1 a week, including meals. While this was only an average wage in 1908, the work was stable and secure at a time of considerable drought, unemployment and uncertainty. The ride to the starting point of the cattle drive would be almost 1,000 kilometres and take 3 weeks in the saddle to get there, and from there that much again over several months to the cattle yards on the coast. The country was rough but beautiful, and the going was tough, sore and monotonous. Along the way they encountered tribes of Aboriginals, still living in their ancestral way, and who were, for the most part, friendly, though there was some occasional antagonism with farmers when they would spear a cow for meat, as there were now fewer kangaroos, given that culling had reduced their numbers significantly. Generally, cattlemen respected the Aboriginals, who often became excellent horsemen themselves, and would often accompany them on a drive, as a number did on this one, acting as guides and go-betweens in the remote country where death was always just a snakebite, fever, or missed waterhole away. On one occasion, a freak storm and flash flood caused him to become separated from the mob, the Australian term for a herd. And after a number of days without food, he ate part of a kangaroo carcass he found that gave him extreme food poisoning. He was found, half dead, days later by an Aboriginal, who helped him return to the droving team, who feared he had perished. The men he worked with were hard men, living in hard times, who spoke little and expected a lot. But Bert's perseverance and determination earned him the respect of the cattlemen, who admired this tenacious boy that had been forced to grow up far too quickly and fend for himself, yet, despite that, was always respectful, cheerful and hard-working. As the cattle drive finally made its way to the stockyards at Geraldton, all the men received their wages, and a bonus was paid for extra cattle not tallied at the start of the contract with graziers. When the bonus was divided among the men, it often amounted to double the wage that was agreed upon, which was more money than Bert had seen his entire life. Well influenced by his grandmother, he deposited the money in a bank account and made plans to visit his brothers and mother back in Perth, where he planned to take formal lessons in reading and writing. Back in town, his stepfather helped him get work, even though he was still under 16 years old. Local unions forbade the employment of minors, so he had to lie about his age in order to work. At a local foundry, he was offered an apprenticeship, but when it was discovered that he had no formal schooling, he was denied any possibility of becoming a tradesman. With little employment available, in his spare time he took up boxing and became quite a proficient amateur. He nevertheless continued in his study and avoided the bars and brothels that most other young men wasted their money in. Years ago, his grandmother had made him promise to never drink intoxicating liquor, and throughout his entire time droving cattle and working on homesteads, he earned the respect of many for keeping to his promise despite their often cajoling him. Becoming restless once again and seeing little prospects in town, by late 1909 he again found work on a remote station, managing a large property and supervising its large mob of sheep. He then moved on to help another settler develop his own farm, advising him on fencing, clearing trees, building a dam, and even a house. It was tough, isolating work, but paid well, and it gave him a home for months at a time. By now he had taught himself to competently read and write, and was in need of another break. He hadn't seen one of his older sisters in a very long time, so after his last job, he paid for his grandmother to accompany him on the journey. On their return, he soon found work repairing fences and wells for the government water department, and later still worked in a railway gang, laying tracks in the ever-expanding network of arteries encroaching on the wild expanse of scrub that was slowly giving way to wheat fields and sheep stations. The years went slowly by, and he continued drifting from one rural contract to another, working sometimes in a team and often alone. Like many men at the time, he was an itinerant worker of no fixed address, following the seasons, harvesting wheat, shearing sheep, mustering cattle, or labouring on government projects, mostly living rough in makeshift tented camps or workers' quarters. There was little time for meeting girls or participating in the communities they moved through. Most pubs were a couple of days' ride in any direction, and so these isolated men lived mostly unwashed, unshaved, and poorly socialised compared to city folk. They carried few belongings and even fewer clothes, rarely changing out of them till they fell apart. They mostly lived on tinned food and damper bread, cooked in a camp oven on an open fire, occasionally stewing bushmeat caught out in the field. But the single greatest curse being the constant oppressive heat and the ever-present magnetic swarms of flies made fresh food impossible to cook on a regular basis. Their sole luxury and comfort was a cup of billy tea at the end of a long day's heavy toil. It was on the sweat, muscles and blood of thousands of illiterate, tough and poorly paid men such as these that the agriculture, mining and infrastructure expansion of entire nations was based. At the end of one job, Bert found himself at a country fair and was goaded into the boxing ring to take on a fighter in one of the many travelling boxing troupes that went from town to town offering prize money and entertainment to locals drunk enough or arrogant enough to throw their hat into the ring. His training while in Perth paid off, as he unexpectedly made short work of his opponent and collected a tidy sum. The manager soon approached him and offered him a place in his boxing stable, which sounded like a good time and a break from the monotony of road gangs, so he quickly signed up. While it was often hard work, the troupe travelled and entertained audiences across the entire country until 1914, when word came of a looming war in Europe. Bert was now 20 and in the fittest shape of his life. Young men everywhere were swarming to the recruitment offices, and his troop soon decided to travel back home and enlist, so he packed up his gear and did the same. Like so many young men at the time, he knew little about the outside world, or of politics, and expected it would all just be a bit of an adventure and a chance to travel to exotic distant shores. Despite the hardships and toughness needed to survive in the Australian outback, they had no idea of the hell that awaited them. It all started easily enough. the boys from the bush found basic training easygoing. Hand-to-hand combat and firearms training likewise posed little challenge to them, compared with the softer and fumbling urban recruits. They were eventually shipped out to Egypt and continued their training in Cairo, with the majority of the other assembling Australian forces. It was an eye-opening experience as they spent their off-duty hours wandering the noisy, narrow streets and souks, touring the Nile and viewing the pyramids. An alien culture worlds away from the quiet country life he was used to. Even their British officers, with their polished brass, stiff moustaches and condescension, seemed alien compared to the easy-going relationships of a boss and his workmen back home. Soon enough they were herded onto troop ships and made their way to the Greek island of Lemnos, which served as a mustering point for the coming amphibious assault on Turkish positions in the Dardanelles. Bert recorded a feeling of serene calmness, with many men writing letters home, as he did, to his grandmother and sister. They were soon preparing to depart and made their way onto longboats with oars. A number of these would be towed close to shore by a motorboat, which would then detach them, leaving the soldiers to slowly row, fully exposed, the rest of the way, under a constant rain of machine gun fire from the shore. Most people are familiar with images of D-Day and the Normandy landing in World War II, but the landings on Gallipoli and Suvla Bay in World War I, while similar, turned out to be a complete disaster, largely because the British had completely underestimated the morale, competence and firepower of their Turkish foes. Having been towed to the wrong stretch of beach, which was ringed with tall, well-defended cliffs, the Australian division was the first ashore. But because the tides were wrong and the currents strong, those that weren't shot up like sitting ducks in their longboats were forced overboard to wade in water up to their armpits, with many of them drowning. British battle doctrine, being a leftover of the Crimean War, had officers, many of whom were dead before they reached the shore, give orders for troops to line up in the open, in formation, which the soldiers promptly ignored, running to the base of the cliffs to avoid gunfire, only to then be pelted with grenades. In Bert's own account, the Turks had machine guns sweeping the strip of beach where we landed. There were many dead already when we got there. We all ran for our lives over the strip of beach. Men were falling around me. We were stumbling over bodies, running blind. Thousands perished on the first morning of the amphibious assault, and those that penetrated inland had incomplete objectives, inaccurate maps, little support, and disorganised reinforcement. Thousands of casualties lay screaming and dying, with very little possibility of being evacuated to hospital ships. Bert was to write, "It worried me for days that I couldn't help the men calling out. This was one of the hardest things for me in the whole war. The Turks never let up. The slaughter was terrible." Troops had no choice but to dig in to the type of trench warfare that was later to characterise the entire European theatre. The situation settled into a stalemate as, over the next few months, both the Allies and the Turks reinforced their positions with almost 1 million men in total, that resulted in a lice-infested, disease-ridden, stinking cesspool of rotting corpses. All the while, men were under a constant hail of shells and participating in pointless waves of assaults and massacres on both sides, ordered by generals who lacked any imagination or humanity. The only comforts they received were occasional rations of butter and bread to replace the almost inedible tinned beef and tooth-breaking biscuits, or the occasional comfort packages sent by people back home, which were randomly distributed among the troops. The only such package Bert was ever to receive was a pair of hand-knitted socks and a message of good luck from a Girl Guides leader called Evelyn Gibson, who lived in a small town in his home state. Bert determined that If he survived, he would visit her and thank her personally for the gift. Both of his older brothers were soon killed in the fighting, Roy by an exploding shell and Joseph by bayonet. Bert had himself buried what pieces of Roy could be found, while Joseph was killed while Bert was himself being treated for a shrapnel wound to the face, as well as internal and leg injuries from a nearby exploding shell. Later, he would suffer regular fits of vomiting and blackouts from the internal injury sustained by the shockwave of the blast, which now made him increasingly unfit for duty. His fighting days were fast coming to an end, and he was soon taken by hospital ship to Alexandria in Egypt. After 8 months of bloody stalemate, the Allies finally withdrew from the peninsula, miraculously evacuating with very few losses. Over the entire failed campaign, the relatively small Australian contingent lost 1 in 5 of its 50,000 volunteers killed, and another 2/5 on top of that wounded, many of these in the first 24 hours. Barely a fifth of Australia's soldiers returned home without serious injury or shell shock, while the total Allied casualties amounted to 300,000, while the Turkish casualties were 255,000. The Gallipoli campaign was a failed bloodbath that set the stage for what was to come in France over the ensuing 3 years. Much of the D-Day campaign in World War II was based on the study of what went wrong in Gallipoli. Bert was repatriated to Australia and remained in a military hospital for some time. On one occasion, he had been given leave to go for a walk in the local town when, still in uniform, he was approached by a girl who noticed his battalion markings and asked about other soldiers from her hometown that had joined it. As they chatted, he asked her name. "Evelyn Gibson," she replied. Dumbstruck, Bert was overwhelmed. In his own words, "Although I had never had any real schooling, I knew what the word providence meant, and that here it was now. Evelyn was the most beautiful girl I had ever seen. I felt like I had known her all my life." The next few months saw him courting Evelyn largely from his own bedside, as apparent cardiac problems resulting from the exploding shell caused doctors to give Bert a prognosis of dying within the next 2 years. He was devastated, as he had just proposed to Evelyn, she had accepted, and her parents had consented, but now he felt honour bound to tell her of this prognosis so she could change her mind and marry someone else. Evelyn would hear nothing of it, and they married soon after. Eventually, Bert was discharged on a modest military pension and desperate to find some light work in order to be able to support Evelyn and their future life together. Familiar tough times came again, with the hordes of other returning soldiers also looking for work, and unscrupulous employers manipulating the labour market for cheap workers. He seemed to be getting nowhere. At this low ebb, he serendipitously came across another veteran who put him in touch with his father-in-law, who was the local Member of Parliament. Explaining his circumstances, lack of education and injuries, the MP wrote a letter of introduction, and Bert soon landed a job as a conductor on the city's tram network. The work would be light and the pay reasonable. But the vibration of the trams eventually worsened his condition, and after trying a series of other lesser-paid jobs, he returned to the trams and studied to become a driver of the larger trolleys that had less vibration, and which would also allow him to sit down. This suited him much better, and no sooner had he begun than one of his supervisors offered to sell him his house, on easy terms, at a bargain price. The young couple jumped at it and moved in soon after. As the next few years rolled by, Bert became active in the local union, which was fighting to protect the rights of workers who hadn't received a pay increase in years, which, coupled with inflation, was increasing the number of the working homeless, including many veterans like himself. They now had 2 children, but successive waves of influenza and diphtheria caught him just as his health had begun to recover, and he was soon bedridden again and warned to leave his job and the city where his condition was likely to kill him. Devastated, they discussed their options. The government had initiated a veterans settlement scheme that would grant loans for the purchase of rural land to ex-servicemen on reasonable terms. Given Bert's vast experience in farming, they took up the offer and purchased a farm less than 30 miles from the district he had grown up in. It was 1922, and the scars of war were slowly beginning to give way to normal life once again. They began by mending fences, clearing scrub and preparing the ground as they moved into the modest homestead with their 2 children. Many such veteran farmers, lacking any knowledge of first-hand skills, struggled to make a success of their venture and frequently sold up their farms and stock, often at reduced prices. Bert soon had paddocks full of bargain-priced sheep, purchased at fire sale auctions, and his many years of hard toil on the farms of others now began to pay off. Weathering the pain of his old wounds and injuries, he still sheared all his own sheep, while his wife learned the skills needed to prepare the fleeces for market. Along with the income from sales of lamb to the butcher, they were soon making a tidy profit and investing in expanding their paddocks and livestock holdings. Another baby later, Bert sent his wife and children to her family for a break, while he and a worker continued to prepare new paddocks. And then, one morning, while out in the field, he noticed smoke coming from the house. Within minutes, it was engulfed in flames, probably caused by the wood-fire oven. They managed to put out the surrounding grass fires and save their stock, but the house and everything in it was gone. All he had left were literally the clothes on his back. He had to spend all of their hard-earned savings and took out new loans to rebuild the house. He was now back to square one. Typically, Bert just picked himself up and kept working, ploughing fields, planting crops, and raising sheep. Over the next few years, they were producing wheat, oats, and barley, and their sheep stock was in excellent condition. By 1927, they had tenaciously fought their way back into a surplus, and another 2 children, now 5 in total. Things were looking up. It was 1932. They just had a bumper crop and super wool yield, but so did everyone else, and prices soon fell through the floor. And that was just the start. The weather became increasingly erratic. New crops failed. Animals inexplicably became sick, and plagues of rabbits spread across the country in biblical proportions, decimating fodder reserves, pasture and grain holdings. Livestock began to starve for lack of food, and there was little spare cash to buy them more. Farmers across the entire country had to foreclose on their mortgages as the economy began to tank and families faced starvation. Tens of thousands of rural communities collapsed in the disaster, and Bert's family, now with 6 children, was forced to give up their farm in bankruptcy and head back to the city, joining the many thousands of others desperate and jostling for what little work was available. Little did they know that they were just one small part of the global Great Depression that would cause destitution and hunger on a scale that even he had not experienced. To top it off, his grandmother had just died, and he hadn't even had a chance to see her since returning from the war. Now, an increasingly sick and exhausted man, he took up labouring jobs shoveling lime and loading trucks, joined by his eldest son. Soon unable to go on, he sought out his old boss on the tram system, who, despite hundreds of applicants queuing for casual work, took him through the back door and got him back on a tram. It was the gossamer thread of kindness that kept his family alive. Bert often marvelled at how his wife managed to make his modest pay go so far, to keep paying rent, keep them all fed, clothed and cheerful, while schooling the children from home and sewing them clothes out of old grain bags. Somewhere in all of this, she managed to give birth to another child. Truly, he had married himself a hero. The inevitable Second World War broke out in 1939, and their two eldest sons enlisted right away. Torn by his feelings, Bert had many times told them of the horrors of his own experiences, but refused to otherwise discourage them from joining. He felt that, as in his own case, it was their own decision to make, and he supported their choices. Soon enough, when Singapore fell to the Japanese, his older boy Barney was listed as missing in action. The other was fighting in the hellish, malaria-ridden jungle campaigns of New Guinea. Their third son also joined near the end of the war, and now, with the hope of their missing son being found alive fading, Evelyn's despair led to a stroke, the effects of which she was to struggle with from that time on. Bert, feeling helpless, volunteered in a civilian air raid unit and administered first aid in local military hospitals. As the war came to a close, news formally reached them of the death of their firstborn, the devastation of which was mixed with the blessing of the safe return of the other two. It was a bitter-sweet occasion experienced by many families that marred what should have been exuberant celebrations across the entire country. Having now been on the trams for several years, they were able to take out a new loan to purchase a small property a short distance into the countryside. They built a poultry shed, hoping to develop a business for one of their sons, who was at the time unemployed. But when he found a solid job in the city, Bert took a chance, resigning his job on the trams to become a poultry farmer himself. He and Evelyn dived right into it, and their business was soon earning him double the wages he had on the trams. Approached by a rival producer wanting to expand, they sold their farm and business for a far greater sum than they had invested, and moved on to buy a new property elsewhere that had similarly been unsuccessful, but in this case was a rundown piggery. Once again, they rolled up their sleeves, rebuilt the homestead and stalls, and his extensive knowledge in animal husbandry saw them quickly make a success of this business too, and once again they were approached to sell, making a substantial profit. Buying ramshackle properties and then restoring them seemed to be his forte, despite his sporadic episodes of illness that kept him bedridden for weeks at a time. Bert would go on to write, "I have never ever worried about trying something different or having a go at something. If it worked out well, good. If not, I would just try something else." His knack for farming and generous advice to his neighbours made him quite a popular local, and he was soon proposed to run for local government. It wasn't long before he was also on the board of various government committees, contributing to progressive new measures that increased the prosperity of towns in the area. By 1960, he was in his late 50s and in deteriorating health. Both he and his wife had suffered a series of heart attacks, with doctors astounded that he was still alive. They put it down to a life of no alcohol, all thanks to his grandmother. It was now time to downsize and retire, and they made a quiet life for themselves in a small cottage, living off his military pension, having helped all their children get married and set up their own families. In 1976, Evelyn became increasingly unwell until one evening, unconscious, she died in his arms after almost 60 years of marriage. Bert was to write, "On this day, the loveliest and most beautiful woman left me. Evelyn had changed my life. Before we married, I was on my own. It was a lonely, solitary life. Evelyn changed that. After our marriage, my life became something which was much more than just me." He ended his memoirs in the very next paragraph. His last words were, "I have lived a very good life. It has been very rich and full. I have been very fortunate and thrilled by it when I look back." His children encouraged him to publish his story, which was compiled into an autobiography called A Fortunate Life and published 2 years later at the age of 85. He soon became a national celebrity and was nominated for Australian of the Year in 1981. Sadly, his health continued to go downhill, and having fractured his hip, he died peacefully in a nursing home at the age of 87. A.B. Facey was, like you and me, nothing special. He had no particular talents or gifts, nor was he from a rich or privileged family. On the contrary, he was born into the most unimaginable poverty and experienced real child slavery at a time when it wasn't at all unusual. He weathered the betrayal of his mother and the exploitation of his employers, only to be shown kindness by other strangers soon after. He had no childhood to speak of, and his adolescent years were often spent in lonely isolation, with few role models or a stable home. Like many children at the time, he had to grow up far too quickly and might have easily ended up in a life of crime, alcoholism, or early death. And yet, throughout his life, despite all the fleeting triumphs, near misses, and unforeseen tragedies, he kept on viewing his life as one great unfolding adventure. Rarely engaging in prolonged self-pity, he never wavered from the promises he made to his grandmother, the one person whose constant influence no doubt often saved his life and informed his best decisions. His fidelity to her was to play itself out over and over in his fidelity to his comrades, his wife, employers, and, perhaps most characteristically, his own conscience. Something we can all perhaps do a bit better.